So, how many of you out there were alive in 1985? Hands up out there. Any of you? No? Just me? Well, that seems rather unlikely, but I am pretty old at this point, so I suppose it could be possible. Well, I guess you'll just take my word for it then, but the thing is video games were a lot different almost 40 years ago now. I actually just had this illustrated to me the other day by good old Snorkers trying and failing to play some sort of awful ZX Spectrum Dracula game, and yes, I know it is redundant to say awful ZX Spectrum game. Wait, why are you booing? Now, I'm right. Anyway, now that I've lost half my audience, my whole point was whether it was playing video games on home consoles or in the arcades, things were quite a bit different way back when. While the 8-bit era would eventually lead to some fairly advanced games, some of which that we've taken a look at here on Zilog and Moto, in the beginning things were much simpler, with extreme examples consisting of games like the Master System version of Spy vs. Spy, which was created as a solo effort by one programmer, Yuji Naka. Hey, I wonder what happened to that guy. He seemed talented enough to maybe one day create a globally recognized gaming franchise that would put Sega on the map. Oh. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now angry because I'm making fun of obscure British 8-bit computers and Sonic's dad. Hey, well, maybe we can get Sir Clive to illegally sell some Sinclair stock and set up the worst jail buddy comedy ever. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, yes, I know, he's dead. You can put the pitchforks down. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Where was I? Oh yeah, video games were different in 1985. An example of this is this week's game, My Hero, which technically made its debut in Japan in January of 1986 before being on board for the launch of the Master System in the United States 8 months later, and then later on making its way to Europe. However, I did say 1985, and that's not an error because My Hero is actually a port of a Corland, not Sega, developed game for Sega System 1 hardware, making My Hero one of the oldest games that we'll look at on this channel that has its origins on Sega hardware. Now, if you're not familiar with the name Corland, you may also know them by the name Banpresto, which is what Corland was renamed to after Bandai bought them in 1989. That original System 1 version of the game dates back to the summer of 1985, and as you would expect, it's a relatively simple game, consisting of very early beat-em-up action. How early? Well, keep in mind that this is before even Renegade, Double Dragon's precursor. So, rather than have a pseudo 3D feel to the environments, My Hero has more in common with what might be considered the true OG beat-em-up, Kung Fu Master. So, how does My Hero hold up almost 40 years later? Is it still worth playing? And how well did Sega handle porting the game over to the Master System? Well, we'll take a look at all of that, but first, a look at the extra slim package.
And here's my copy of My Hero for the Master System. Considering just how old it is, this copy has held up remarkably well, with the outer cover fully intact, including the hang tab at the top. You might notice that the hang tab looks a little weird, like it's bent in half, and that's because the hang tabs are designed to be folded down for storage so that you don't have to cut them off. Philistines. But on these thin clamshells that Sega used for the Sega Card titles, there's not enough room for them to fold down, so they have this extra bend that allows them to be folded in half to fit. Just a weird oddity with these Sega Card titles that you might not see if someone did remove the hang tab. With the outer cover holding up so well, it's allowed the inner cover to be pristine, with no water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear present. I do have an issue with the card label that we'll see in a minute, so I might replace just the card itself at some point. But if you're in the market for a complete copy, there's some range to what that will cost you, with the US version going for around $30 right now. In Europe, it's a little more confusing because it's both cheaper and more expensive, with the cartridge version of the game being relatively inexpensive, selling for slightly less than the US version, but the European Sega Card version is actually somewhat rare, like most Sega Card titles in Europe are. So if for some crazy reason you wanted that specific release, expect to spend in the triple digits. That's if you can even find one for sale. The cover art itself is the same formatting that most other Sega Card titles had, that features a hand holding the Sega Card itself, which in turn has the actual artwork of the game on it. And, I mean, I guess it's somewhat clever because I think Sega was trying to show off how small the Sega Cards were, but honestly, I'd rather just have the actual artwork, which is what Sega did for the European cartridge version. And as long as we're talking about artwork, as much as I like to complain about some of the art on the early Master System titles, I do like this direct approach that they used here, because if there's one thing that you're doing in My Hero, it's punching punks right in the face. As usual with games of this era, I do prefer the original Japanese artwork, but in this case, I'm fine with either version, as they're both decent for the styles used. Just don't look too hard at the Korean version. I don't know what the hell is going on there, but if you happen to know, definitely comment down below to let the rest of us in on it. Flipping over the back, and there's the standard early Master System formatting with 2 screenshots at the top and then flavor text down below. The screenshots are actually decent for the era, even though the game looks very green. I guess we'll see if it's actually supposed to look like that in a minute or if it's some sort of printing error. In the flavor text section, I enjoy this part, whose name happens to be Mohican, seemingly pointing fun at how ridiculous it is that they couldn't come up with a better name for the boss of a gang of punks with mohawks than Mohican. But it wouldn't be a mid-80s video game from Japan if there wasn't some sort of weird translation issue, would it? Opening up the package, and you can see that label issue that I was referring to. Unfortunately, I think this copy just didn't have the card protector when I purchased it, hence the damage. Pro tip, if your Sega Card is missing the original protector or it's just rotted away, search for replacement Hue card protectors, as they're much easier to find in 2024 and they fit the same way. As far as the manual goes, it's fine. There's not really a whole lot to discuss here, and the game is probably over-explained in the 4 pages, but I like that it's got the usual custom artwork and that they at least tried to explain the backstory, as simple as it is. I think the highlight of this particular manual is that on June 22nd, 1988, Ross was able to set the high score, but then the next day, Shannon was able to break his record. Good job, Shannon. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see just how heroic My Hero is. Earlier, I compared My Hero to Kung Fu Master, and anyone that's played both games will probably understand why. In both games, you're playing as a character that apparently doesn't know how to move to their left or the right, and instead is just constantly moving backwards and forwards to deal with a host of enemies that are in their way. Other similarities involve the characters being able to jump, duck, and then perform multiple types of attacks based on the character's positioning, and then also at times having to battle multiple enemies on screen at once, making the player have to think about the best way to dispatch the enemies without taking damage themselves. However, while the games share some basic similarities, there's also some definite differences as well, and I don't think that you could call My Hero a clone of Kung Fu Master any more than you could say Crime Fighter's a clone of Double Dragon. Any person who happened to see both machines in an arcade would quickly be able to tell the differences between the two games just from an immediate visual style alone. But drop a quarter in both machines, and someone who starts My Hero thinking that they can just get by because they were good at Kung Fu Master is going to be separated from their money very quickly. I don't really want to belabor those differences much longer, but I will highlight one thing different that's integral to how My Hero is designed as opposed to Kung Fu Master, and that's the fact that your hero, i.e. the character that you play as, does not have a health bar outside of boss fights, and I'll cover those more in a bit. But as you progress through the levels, your character, we'll call him Steve because that's apparently his name in the Western versions of the game, is apparently somewhat of a weakling because anytime he takes a single hit, whether it be from one of the punks, pigs, dogs, or perhaps something in the environment, he is going down. This is very much an old arcade trope, and while it makes sense when you're trying to make money as a quarter muncher, that level of perfection needed to be successful doesn't necessarily make for a lot of fun. I'm a little surprised at this because Kung Fu Master got it right and gave your character a life bar, so not having one in My Hero feels like a regression, even though it came out 8 months after Kung Fu Master. Okay, that's the last comparison between those two I'm going to make, I promise. Let's move on to what you actually do in My Hero, now that we've dealt with the one-hit kill portion of gameplay. The premise for the game is that Steve, who unfortunately in 2024 looks a bit like Donald Trump with that blue suit, red tie, and gold hair, and his girlfriend Remy are minding their own business when the imaginatively named Mohican, a leader of a local group of punks, thinks it's a good idea to flat out kidnap Remy, so it's up to you as Steve to go chase him down and get her back. Despite the fact that Steve has a bit of a glass jaw, he apparently has taken a self-defense class or two, and he can throw a punch. He can also perform a standing kick, which is useful as it has a bit more range than his fists, and then there's probably his most useful attack at all, the jump kick. If you're going to be successful in My Hero at all, you're going to learn to use the jump kick, and not just because you do it anytime you hit the jump button, which almost makes up for Coreland not giving you a health bar. Almost. You start out your mission to get Remy back, taking on punks that come at you from both sides of the screen, as you attempt to move to the right. Soon you'll run into punks that are also in windows above you, and while you can't attack them, you can hit the bottles that they try to drop on your head, turning them into projectiles for taking out multiple punks in a row. As you progress through the level, the punks will thin out in places, and you'll find that the game has significant platforming sections as well, with you having to avoid both spike-filled tires and jump kick your way over fire-spewing pits. Normally, I'm not a fan of platforming sections in beat-em-ups. While yes, it does break up the monotony of just constantly walking from left to right and beating up enemies, usually it's poorly implemented, with the beat-em-up controls not lending themselves to platforming sections, because, well, they're beat-em-up controls. I think that's kind of self-explanatory. I still have nightmares about some of those moving platform pit jumps in Double Dragon. Ugh. However, with a game like My Hero, since it's only a beat-em-up in the loosest sense of the genre, it actually works, and does do exactly what I mentioned by keeping the players on their toes. When players haven't seen those sections of the levels before, they don't know what's coming next, and you end up with a nice bit of excitement and stress. Eventually, once you learn a level well enough, you'll be able to make it through to the boss fight with Mohican, and the game turns into a proto-Street Fighter, with you and Mohican in a one-on-one fight, with each person's life bar represented as a 1 to 10 hits chart. While the fight against Mohican is relatively simple, inserting this variation in gameplay is a bold move, as at that time, I can only think of 2 games on the market that had even attempted the one-on-one genre, in Karate Champ and Yar Kung Fu. I enjoy the sudden inclusion of boss fights because after stressing the entire level about not getting hit, all of a sudden you have some more freedom to really throw down, making the boss fight a bit of a reward, even before you rescue Remy from Mohican. Assuming you win, and you probably will if you've made it through the previous level to get there, Steve will console the battered Mohican because that's what good guys do, but while he's distracted, someone else comes in a time machine and kidnaps Remy again, leaving Steve to chase afterwards. At least, that's what happens in the arcade version. From a level 1 base gameplay perspective, both the arcade version and the home version of My Hero are relatively similar, so thus far I've basically been describing both games. This alternate timeline concept that the arcade version has, with each of the game's 3 levels taking place in a different environment with different enemies and hazards, was totally abandoned in the Master System version. Instead, the Master System version always has Steve fighting Mohican and his gang in 3 levels that all have a similar theme, just with enough new things thrown in so that it doesn't feel like that you're playing the exact same level 3 times. As much as I'm critical of My Hero for things like one-hit kills and simplistic gameplay, that stuff I can chalk up to it being an arcade game from 1985. Where I really have an issue with the Master System version of the game specifically is the fact that it's only an accurate port of a third of the arcade game, with no real reason why. Keep in mind, My Hero was designed for Sega's System 1 arcade board. This wasn't a System 16 game or a Super Scalar game, it was designed for a platform that wasn't that much more powerful than the Master System. Longtime viewers might remember that in the last episode of Season 1, we reviewed Choplifter for the Master System, and while it certainly wasn't a perfect port, it at least had all the levels, and that for a game based on the System 2 board, not the System 1. So, what happened? Well, unfortunately, the Sega Card happened. If you're not aware, Sega Card games, while similar to the PC Engine TurboGrafx 16 Hue cards, are incredibly limited, only allowing for a game to be no larger than 32 kilobytes, and if that seems small, well, it is, because that size makes it only a quarter megabit, so 1/4 the size of Choplifter or any Mega cartridge release for the Master System. Of course, with the amount of ROM space on the Sega Card being so small, there wasn't room to have 3 types of backgrounds, 3 types of enemies, etc., which is why the first level design was repeated instead of having the original 3 different level types. Ultimately, considering the limitations that the developers were dealing with here, I understand why they made that choice. Not that they really had one to make. And I think they did the best job that they could in still making a game that at least resembled the arcade machine, especially if all someone knew about it was the attract screen. However, that doesn't really help me from making a good arcade port, and I just don't understand what on earth Sega management was thinking. I know that Sega released other formerly arcade titles on the Sega Card, like the previously reviewed Hang On and Ghost House, among others, but if a game needs more space, put it on a cartridge that can have more. And, of course, the ironic thing here is that most people in Europe that have played My Hero played the cartridge version anyway. Considering the fact that the look of the game only reflects the first level of the arcade machine, let's throw out the other 2 levels and just compare the Master System version to that, to be fair. From that perspective, the Master System version is a pretty good port. It's not quite as colorful, the sprites are a little bit smaller, but honestly it's pretty close, especially considering how much room that they didn't have to work with. I'd say it's comparable to the job that they did with the aforementioned Choplifter, where it's definitely not as good, but it still looks and feels very much like the original, as long as you forget that the second and third rounds existed. And let's be real, it's an arcade game from 1985, it's only going to look so good anyway. From a sound perspective, the music isn't bad, but just keep in mind, due to the limited space, there's not much of it. Like with the graphics, the designers chose to just match up the first level of the arcade version, so you get individual level and boss themes for that first level. And they actually sound really close, to the point that I think I prefer the instrumentation used in the Master System version of the boss theme, as it just sounds smoother. The sound effects included are decent as well, there's not a ton of them, but they all sound good, and the smash when someone gets punched or kicked is quite satisfying. My Hero is a tough game to rate in 2024, as things have just changed so much since it was released. As I was playing the game, I was really trying hard to have to put myself in the shoes of a kid in late 1986 and think, would I really be entertained enough to play the game repeatedly, knowing that the only real payoff was trying to get a high score, and that the game simply wasn't as good as the arcade version, due to the change in level structure, and not to mention the fact that the Master System has no continue option. Ultimately, I settled on giving My Hero 2 stars, because I could see playing it back in the day when there wasn't really that many other options, and just living off of the excitement of trying to get a little bit further each time. But I definitely can't give it more than that due to it being an incomplete port.
And that's it for My Hero for the Master System. If I'm being honest, My Hero exists today as more of a historical curiosity than anything you would actually want to play. But having said that, I do think it's interesting to look at, because it is part of the history of beat-em-ups and one-on-one fighting games. But Sega really ruined what should have been a great port by being cheap, and it's hard to look at the game and not think about how much better it could have been, simply because of how good a job the programmers did with what they had to work with. Also, just as a final note, Ross and Shannon from the manual, my hat's off to you, because I was not able to beat either of your scores. Maybe I'll come back to it at some point, see if I can make it to that third round. Probably not. Next time on the channel, it's our first look at a series that I somewhat surprisingly just picked up the last game in the series that I didn't have yet. I say somewhat surprisingly because none of the games in the series really are particularly valuable, but as I found out, finding complete copies of some of them isn't the easiest thing in the world to do. There's 5 games in the series, so I probably need to go ahead and start reviewing some of them to get them in the schedule, but also with all of the recent focus on the United States and the election, I thought I would go with something that's got some more British origins. Maybe I'll even go out and get some fish and chips as I work on that review. I do love some Long John Silvers. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 259. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.